The 78-year-old interim president in Tunisia, Fouad Mabaza, who was president of the lower house of parliament under Ben Ali, has decreed that he and the current interim government will stay in power until election in July for a council to rewrite the constitution. In Egypt, the 75-year-old Mohammed Tantawi heads the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, made up of the heads of services that rules by decree. The interim prime minister of Egypt, who went to Purdue University, he's an exception. He's only 58. But the vice prime minister, Dr. Yahya Gamal, is in his mid-70s. I don't have anything against people in their mid-70s. I'm getting there myself, but still. Steve Call of the New American Foundation, after traveling to Tunisia, reported, the labor unions in Tunisia, which had been a safety valve for the non-threatening expression of discontent under Ben Ali, and for that reason lacked any real credibility, are today among the few organized forces in Tunisian politics. Similar forces include Islamist groups and remnants of the old regime. The leaderless younger generation will have no choice but to form pragmatic alliances with these elements. Egypt, like Tunisia, is still being ruled by the old order, and the official labor unions and civil service act as anchors to the interim regime. And despite the disbanding of the NDP, its structure and local leadership remains a major and possibly deciding factor in the countryside. In fact, we may be guilty of glamorizing the Arab Spring, and the danger is that we will expect too much. Perhaps we have read into the so-called revolution our own hopes based on our tendency to worship the altar of democracy. I have no doubt that democracy is important for Egypt and Tunisia's future, but it won't put bread on the table today, and it won't answer the immediate demands of the people. The demands are economic and social in nature. The secret of wealth does not appear to lie in democracy alone, and it does not necessarily reside in any particular leader. But it does have a lot to do with the economic policies a country adopts and with the prevailing economic conditions. Young people formed the core of the Tahrir protests. By all accounts, however, the social issues they consider to be the most important were not democracy or human rights. In polls, those young people have stressed in the following order: poverty reduction, 92%, rising prices, 90%, fighting corruption and entitlement, 88%, and reforming the educational system, 86%. Only 63% said it was important for people to have a larger role in government. In Tunisia, the protests began in the countryside over social justice and economic conditions. It only morphed into democracy and freedom when it hit the salons of Tunis. In Egypt, 2/3 of the population are under 30, and the young make up 90% of the nation's unemployed or underemployed. In Tunisia, the picture is similar to that of Egypt. The unemployment rate is officially plagued at 14%, but youth unemployment is estimated at 30%. Just to stand still, Egypt will have to create 10 million jobs over the next decade, and Tunisia needs an additional 1 million jobs. But jobs are in short supply in both countries, and the immediate prospect is not encouraging. The uncertainty that has accompanied the protests has brought new job-creating foreign direct investment down to a trickle. One Egyptian official told me it was down to 0 now. Tourism, a major employer and critical for the future of both economies, is on life support throughout the region. At this time of uncertainty in both countries, we need to distinguish where should we be putting our emphasis and resources, and how should we encourage developments. And we need to be realistic about how much impact we can have. Back in the 90s, we still had an economic assistance program in Egypt. It gave us access to the ministries and ministers. That no longer exists. Back in the 90s, the United States was still respected as a model. Today, association with the U.S. can be a net negative if opinion polls are at all accurate. Where we can make a difference certainly is in the short term. Immediate budget support and debt forgiveness are obvious first steps, but buying time is not enough. In fact, by staving off an economic crisis and the reforms it could force on governments, we could be adding to the longer-term meltdown with far greater consequences. For starters, Egyptian and Tunisian populations continue to grow. There's been no moratorium on births based on the revolution. Today, there are 83 million Egyptians. By 2025, projections by the Population Reference Bureau put the number at 103 million. 20 million more mouths to feed, 20 million more children to educate, 20 more million in need of health care. In Tunisia, the population of 10.5 million is projected to grow to 11.5 million over the next decade. Regardless of the programs of the international community, neither the economy of Egypt nor that of Tunisia is capable of achieving sufficient jobs over the next decade without a significant internal and locally generated economic and structural reform. No matter how helpful the international community or the United States would like to be, only the Egyptians and Tunisians themselves can effectively reform their countries. They have to determine their own future and define their own economic and social structures. We can and should advise, but recognize it is not our decision. For 20 years, we have relied on military force to impose our will in the region. Perhaps it's time to take a hard look at the benefits of diplomacy, subtlety, indirection, personal relationships, sympathetic understanding, cultural sensitivity, and issue-related alliances to further our interests and stop the idea that every challenge is a zero-sum game or that every problem is a nail with the only solution being a hammer. Let me repeat now what President Obama said. We're going to have to be creative. We're going to have to be engaged. We're going to have to look for opportunities where the best impulses of the Middle East come to the fore and the worst impulses are weakened. That is very good advice.